Can we do one thing before? Oh, there we go.
Welcome, everybody. So glad you're here. I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Joe to do introductions here.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. It's great seeing everybody here. And this evening we have a new friend, sort of new, an old friend, new friend, Zachary Wagner, professor. And I'm going to allow you, my brother, to share everything about yourself. Give us a little insight into your background, what you did your PhD studies in, how'd
Sure.
you look into this world of Stoicism? It's not a particularly common philosophy.
hmm
How did you get involved in that? Let's start with that.
Sure. So I work for a interdenominational Christian organization called the Center for Pastor Theologians. I'm their director of programs. We do cohorts and fellowships, kind of continuing education for Christian ministers across the entire denominational spectrum, such as it is. And I recently finished up my PhD or DPhil, as they happen to call it, at the University of Oxford. Oxford's kind of old and traditionalist, so everyone else starts calling it a PhD, and they say, no, no, we're sticking with the DPhil. So I'm a PhD, I'm a DPhil in New Testament studies, early Christianity and ancient Judaism was kind of the field that I was in. And I did some work on the idea of reward in the New Testament, specifically, it was called Wages from God in Matthew and Paul. So this traced the idea, this metaphor of human beings being God's employees or servants, but servants we don't always have that kind of employment connotation. Servants can go towards a slavery relationship or it can go towards an employment relationship where there's actual wages. So I wanted to focus on that employment side. So I traced this idea in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the Second Temple literature into the kind of the early rabbis and a little bit in the Mishnah, particularly Mishnah Avot. I'm pretty sure, Joe, you corrected me on my pronunciation of that when we were talking about this in Australia. But that was my PhD research. And more recently, since I finished that up, I have become quite interested in the intersection between Stoicism, which is a ancient Roman, Greco-Roman philosophy that I'll give a proper introduction to in a little bit, and the overlap between Stoicism and Christianity in particular, and early Christianity. So, yeah, there's a lot of directions we could go, but I'll pause there, and that's kind of basic overview. Get any kind of questions, reactions, and further
Well, that's
elaborations
great.
requested.
That's that's great. So let's start there.
Sure.
What is Stoicism? We know what Stoicism is as far as a caricature, that
Yes.
you just saw a person fall to their death and you have no emotions.
Yes.
So beyond the caricature, I don't know how that developed, but what is Stoicism? Can you just give us a little background here as far as the basic ideas,
Yep.
teachings,
Yep.
values, and then we'll discuss some of the key thinkers. Is it still relevant today and so forth? But what is basically broadly Stoicism before we start digging into some of its deeper ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. So Stoicism is a philosophical school that comes out of what's sometimes called the Hellenistic period of the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition. So this is that era right around the Second Temple period, actually, kind of after the Alexandrian conquest when Greek culture kind of takes over the Mediterranean world in a uniquely homogenous way. And this is after the great kind of Athenian philosophers that we think of with Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. This is a little bit later than that, a couple centuries later into the kind of the last few centuries of the BCE era is when the Hellenistic schools are starting to emerge, and these include the Epicureans and the Cynics and the Stoics. Those are kind of the big three that are all downstream from Aristotle and ultimately back to Plato and Socrates. And I'll give you kind of a very brief overview of those three, and that'll give you a sense of kind of where Stoicism sits among all three of them. So, everybody in this time is asking the question of what is humanity's telos, or what is the point of being a human? What is the purpose of our life as human beings? And the kind of Greek word for this is eudaimonia, which can translate to something like happiness or even blessedness, or flourishing sometimes is a translation that you sometimes see for eudaimonia. And the Epicureans take kind of the hedonistic route, and the hedonic school, which is not quite what we associate with hedonism today, but it is a pleasure-focused view of what it means to be a happy, flourishing person. So the Epicureans took this pleasure-focused view. And then the Cynics and the Stoics kind of reject the pleasure focused view and instead focus on virtue, which they're picking up from Aristotle and going back to Plato. And the main difference between the Stoics and the Cynics is that the Cynics are pretty aggressively, you could almost say like monastic or ascetic. They deny the good of wealth, kind of worldly possessions, and you would see a cynic kind of sitting out in the cold and not wearing anything and sleeping on a rock just to because he could. And he's saying, well, all that really matters is being a virtuous person. The Stoics goes back to this guy Zeno, who is in these dialogues and would invite folks to kind of engage in this new philosophy and sit on his porch as he taught them. And the Greek word for porch is stoa, from which we get the word stoic. It's just the guys who would hang out on the porch is kind of what it means. And Zeno was the first teacher there. So that's the kind of like world that Stoicism is entering into, is this Cynic, Epicurean, Stoic trifecta. And three of the kind of basic overall tenets of Stoicism um, are these. So, one is a rationalistic ordering of the world, a view that there is a kind of single, logical, rationalistic principle that holds the world together. So, to live the flourishing eudaimonistic life means to tap into this rational ordering of the world, to live, the Stoics would use the language of in accordance with nature. So that's one, this kind of rational organization of the world. Two is this division of control between the things that you can control and the things that you can't control. So down to kind of like even popular Stoicism today, which we'll talk. One of the basic things that Stoic teachers would impress upon their students was if there are things that are outside of your control, literally don't worry about those things. Only worry about the things that you can control. So if something happens that makes you angry, well, chances are that it was something outside of your control. Don't bother being angry about it. The only thing you can control is your reaction to that thing that could happen. And this would go, all the way from stubbing your toe up to the loss of a loved one. This was considered a way of kind of leveling out your emotional response, even to great losses and devastating things that happened in the world. Uh, and then, thirdly, and perhaps most kind of notoriously, Joe, you already referenced the kind of stoic caricature of someone who watches someone die and then is kind of has a muted emotional response. The third kind of basic teaching of Stoicism that we could highlight is this mistrust of emotion. and particularly what's sometimes called the passions in particular. And the Stoic philosophy looks out over the survey of kind of human experience and says, you know what really gets us in trouble more than anything else is unhinged passion and emotion. Things like anger, things like lust, things like greed, things like prejudice and when the things that we desire bubble up in our emotional cells so much so that we misread the world as it is, and our emotional passion faculties, such as they are, override our rational faculties. So when we are in a frenzy of passion or a frenzy of anger is a nice one um, to highlight, we act irrationally, and that's when we start getting into vicious behavior that harms us and harms others, and then is contrary to this eudaimonistic, flourishing human life that the Stoics were after. Um, some big kind of broad brushstrokes
Yeah.
there. You know, it can get kind of technical, but that's my overview as best as I can offer it in 10 minutes.
No, no, that's very interesting. I'd like to explore a little of this before we move on. And if anybody, of course, has any questions, reflections, this is a dialogue between us all. So my question is very interesting. First, is there in Stoicism anything comparable to mercy, compassion, charity, love? Is that an I know that's not one of their four virtues, but uh, is it? I mean, I wouldn't think it is.
Yeah, well, justice is.
Yeah,
So
justice, but
they kind of adopt this and justice in the sense of doing the right thing, including towards others at all times
that's not
for the
charity, is
it's
it?
not quite, no, but I think some of the defenders of
Okay.
it might say, well, that's where you locate love kind of within a Stoic
Hmm.
ethic. But you're right to point out, and I think this is a very fair critique of Stoicism, is that there are passages where the Stoics are even a little wary of what you might call love or charity,
Mhm.
particularly in the sense of attachment that causes you to act in an irrational or even a vicious way. So this is kind of like anyone familiar with like the Star Wars prequels or the fall of Anakin Skywalker. It's a very kind of like Jedi Knight philosophy where you're trying to avoid attachment because attachment makes you do stupid things. So if you see a beautiful woman or a beautiful man and you're infatuated with that person, that could compromise your virtue if it really comes to it. If you're so kind of infatuated or overwhelmed with desire or lust, you might lie to impress that person, or you might steal to make sure that you don't fall out of their good graces, or they may uh, pressure you in some way to do something that is in violation of virtue, which is the highest, and really in Stoicism, the only good. The only thing that is an unqualified good is virtue in a Stoic conception. And there's there's uneasiness around, I think, what we might think of as love and charity. But I do want to give it as, no pun intended, charitable as a read as we can, and say that there is a robust kind of discourse in Stoicism around the common good and this kind of ordering of society that is serving others, but also this dark side where, you know, someone is mourning and grieving. A kind of purist stoic approach would say if they're coming to you for comfort, it's actually really important that you don't kind of descend into their emotional state of sorrow and keep a state of distance. And you even have examples of saying pretend to be sad, but just make sure you're not actually sad because you don't want to drop down to that level. So people today will try to revise some of these things and say, well, empathy is actually okay, empathy is good, and empathy is something that we want to encourage. But I think a really strict reading of certain Stoic ideals, I think you would say there's not a really robust place for love and charity, as you say. And I think that's something that that the kind of Yahwistic faiths, if faiths, if you will kind of can offer as a counterweight to this hyper rationalistic Stoic ideal.
Yeah, two more things.
Sure.
The idea of flourishing,
Hmm.
happiness, blessedness,
Yep.
uh, it it seems to me, again, this isn't my area of expertise, but from everything you've described, I don't see the one of the four virtues is wisdom.
Hmm.
Wisdom, at least in Jewish thought, understands subtlety, nuance, and
Yep.
it's true that emotions can lead us astray, but wise usage can also build us up, not just tear us down. So where is the role of nuance, of subtlety, of appropriate usage rather than it's potentially going to lead us astray, so we won't follow it at all? That doesn't seem to me to be contributing to human flourishing because it doesn't allow for the full human potential, right?
Yes, but this is exactly the thing, is that much like the I want to be fair because in a
Yeah.
sense, Stoicism is the least dualistic of the Greek philosophical schools. It doesn't have this hard split that you see in Platonism, for instance, between the kind of rationalistic divine world of the logos and the forms and the kind of gross, meaty, earthy stuff of human embodiment. And again, I think this is something that the Jewish tradition in particular does a really good job of holding together over and against the kind of Greek philosophical tradition. And then Christians kind of can, you could say, get the best of both worlds or maybe the worst of both worlds, depending on your perspective in trying to balance that out. So, yeah, I'm trying to make sure I'm not losing your question here. Yeah, the place of nuance.
Yeah.
So here's what I would say is there's a strong emphasis in Stoicism on the wisdom accrued through life lived. It's a very practical, pragmatic philosophy in that sense. And it for that reason, I think is pretty timeless. Like we'll later in the conversation, I want to make sure I introduce you to the kind of three Stoic authors that
Yes.
have been preserved and come down to us today. But I would recommend this to kind of anybody, if you're a thoughtful person who likes to read, these are not dense. I mean, there are dense portions, but you can pick up Seneca on anger and really benefit from it and say, this guy has thought a lot about the nuance of the experience of anger and um, will have kind of counterpoints and counterexamples that he feels free to grab from even different schools that he disagrees with. And he's like, hey, this guy's not on the team, but he actually has some insight here. So there's a freedom with which the Stoics feel that they can glean wisdom wherever they see it. So I think that allows for a certain introduction of nuance. And then also that emphasis on the living of life and experience leading to wisdom, not merely the kind of accrual of right arguments and factual
Mm.
knowledge. It's a very I would say a very robust view of wisdom. But to your point, Rabbi Joe, the there's a skepticism towards the emotional life as something that needs to be controlled and reined in. That again, some defenders will want to say is has nuance, and I think it does have some nuance, but I don't think you can get away from the fact that these people just didn't trust emotion. And it is a bit of a mind over matter, but really like mind over body or mind over gut. And um, back to anger, Seneca in On Anger, which is his kind of long treatise on the dangers of anger, he addresses the argument like, well, anger can actually be really good because it can lead the warrior to be very courageous. It can lead you to great acts of defense of others and things like this. And he's like, yeah, but that's nothing that you couldn't do from a very kind of strict rationalistic perspective either, focusing on things like justice. And um, yeah, so I worry that I'm giving it like kind of more of a negative spin than it has in the reading of it when you actually read the Stoics. But these are challenging ideas. Like what he says there is like, why would you want to? So to the argument that anger can be used to make one courageous, he'll say, well, why would you want to use a vice in service of virtue? A vice is not something that can be instrumentalized to a good end. Focus on the virtue of courage, and then you won't need anger to get there. I'm not saying I fully endorse that,
Right.
but I'm just saying this is the way the Stoics are going to think about this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, and yeah, the rabbis would certainly not here to compare and contrast or challenge by any means, but we would try to harness the energy from those darker potentials or aspects within, and utilize the energy in a positive way. But I
Yes.
want one more quick question on a foundational. I don't even know if I would call it. It is an emotion, but it's sort of central to our existence as humans, at least in our traditions here. Love.
Yes.
Do mothers, an ideal Stoic mother or an ideal Stoic father, not have deep, enduring love, passionate love for a partner or a child? Not passionate, but impassioned love for a child?
Yes. Yeah, they do, but in a certain only a
Oh,
certain sense. Because it is right and good and in a sense appropriate and in accordance with nature. Again, nature is a very important kind of principle in Stoicism, adjudicating what is virtuous and vicious. Um, but so it's good and right and natural for you to show affection towards your partner or towards your children. But they also caution against being overly attached to your spouse and your children. And that's not to say that you should feel free to leave them or to mistreat them. Certainly not, because that would again be a violation of the kind of standard of virtue
yeah.
that is commended. But you have these some of the most controversial passages that you have in Stoicism have to do in the kind of Stoic discourse have to do with what can be perceived as an indifference even towards children.
Hmm.
So there's this famous passage, I believe this is Epictetus or Epictetus, depending on who you ask. So that's a kind of inside joke back to a conversation that Joe and I had. But Epictetus, where he talks about when you're embracing, I think the example is your daughter, and you're embracing and you're kissing your daughter. Remember that she is but a mortal. And then likewise, if you're embracing or kissing your partner or your spouse, remember that this person was destined to die.
Hmm.
And that's kind of like a thought exercise that the Stoics will engage in to preempt the grief that would come if you were to lose that person or lose that attachment or lose that relationship. And it's a way of training your mind to remember my happiness, my virtue, the rightness of the world, and the natural order of things is not bound up in my connection with this other person, but actually transcends it. So then, if you do find that your 10-year-old daughter, for example, dies a tragic death, the Stoic has prepared him or herself for a rational experience of that loss that says, well, fate has determined that that was the number of days allotted for this life. I can view it as a blessing and a even a preferred and wonderful thing that I had this experience, but no terrible thing has happened to me because it was as it was meant to happen, and all life eventually must die. That is the kind of lot of mortals to die. Um, and man, that's a hard one
Yeah.
to stomach. But you can see, I think, the yes and the no to like, well, surely you should love your family. Sure, you should love your children. And I think the Stoics say in such a way that it trumps out over this kind of ethical, virtuous ideal, and not in such a way that you will fall apart and unravel and turn into a puddle if that thing is taken away from you. Yeah, I think of connections to Job here, all up and down, in terms of how to deal with suffering, how to process loss, how to think about the goodness of the divine will or of fate, and to wrestle with these things. But I'll take Job over the Stoics on this point in particular.
Thank you. Share. We got you.
Thank you. Well, so I'm really curious, were there any successful Stoic communities? Did they really manage to pull that off?
That's a good question.
Um, Well, in the sense that Stoicism, broadly construed, was the most popular philosophy of the kind of high Roman Empire in the first and second century. It was very widely respected. It was kind of how educated, thoughtful people thought about the world. I don't know. It's not quite the sort of thing where it's sectarian, where people are kind of going, and this is Stoic community. It's a bit more individualistic in that sense, and um it's not like, for example, cynicism with it, which is a bit more withdrawn in its approach to like the cynic kind of puts himself outside of the functioning society. The Stoic, I think, can function very well within it and sees themselves as attaining to, again, to this virtuous ideal. You see language of if you can get here, you'll be like a god among men is the language that is used. And it is seen as a path to life as it ought to be lived. But it's not like, it's not like Qumran where folks are going to go and separate themselves and we're going to do a Stoic thing over here. It's not quite like that. Um,
So
yeah,
it was sort of
I could,
aspirational. It was like
yes,
it was
very
like
aspirational.
okay,
Yes.
thank you. Mhm.
And it was viewed, I mean, Joe, if it's all right with you, I can give the kind of big three of
Yeah.
folks because I think this actually ties in well.
Yeah.
So the big three of Stoic authors that we have preserved for us today are Seneca and Epictetus, and then Marcus Aurelius. All three of whom are really interesting characters in their own right. So Seneca was a bit of a polymath, Renaissance man, whatever kind of anachronistic label you want to put on him. But he's a playwright, he's a
Wow.
senator, he's an advisor to important politicians, philosopher, and then he writes these treatises and these letters back and forth. He's kind of all over the place in the highest echelons of Roman power. Um, and wrote quite a bit, has a long uh, disc correspondence rather of letters that's preserved for us today, and these ethical treatises on anger is one I already mentioned. Um, De Beneficis, which is on gifts or benefits and the exchange of things between humans. And these are all pretty accessible, like I say. And then Epictetus is really interesting because he was a slave, or at least a former slave, perhaps born into slavery, perhaps became a slave later in life. and has a lot to say about how um, you can adopt Stoicism as a philosophy, and you can all the way from an emperor to a slave, you can be no better or worse off if you adopt this approach to living life. So it kind of, at least in the ideal sense, in the aspirational sense, can kind of function at all levels of society, which was itself a bit of an innovation because the kind of earlier Aristotelian ideals in like Nicomachean Ethics, some of them just like weren't available to anyone other than wealthy, or might not have even been available to women for a variety of reasons. It's kind of being wealthy helps you be virtuous. In fact, and you can't really get there without it because there's this kind of mm, uh, can I pronounce this right? Magnanimity that's associated with virtue in some of these other systems. But Stoicism tries to at least have an ideal towards being egalitarian in that sense. So Seneca, who's this like playwright philosopher, Epictetus, who was a slave for much of his life and then rises out of that in a station. And then, maybe most fascinating of all is Marcus Aurelius, who was, of course, an emperor of Rome. And Marcus's meditations are probably the most famous and well-known Stoic writings. Full stop. And those are, people still buy that, people still read it. It's really fascinating reading. It's almost devotional, and it's like a journal of this thoughtful guy on how to be an emperor and how to live a virtuous life, whether in spite of or perhaps like especially because of his status as an emperor. And of course, Marcus Aurelius is the guy at the beginning of Gladiator, who's the emperor and then gets murdered. Spoiler alert. But I'm not sure how faithful of a kind of historical account Gladiator would be for getting to know Marcus. But yeah, from the kind of 50, 60 CE to 200 CE is this kind of high Stoicism era. And yeah, maybe one more thing I'll say, uh, was anybody successful at this? A friend of mine who she did her dissertation on Christianity and Stoicism, she says one of the weakest points of Stoicism is they don't really have an explanation. They have all these kind of very rationalistic, logical, aspirational, ethical ideals, but what they don't have, in her view, is an explanation for, and these are her words, not mine, for why human beings are so trash at actually following this ideal. So there's a lot of reflection on this would be great, and you can get kind of mental assent to, yeah, that would be a great way to live if I could do it. But if we're honest, we actually can't attain to the rationalistic ideal. So that I think signals something interesting to us. So yeah,
Yeah,
long answer, but I hope
is
that's
no,
helpful.
no, no. It was
Background.
great. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions, follow-ups before I ask another quick question? It's about we've been talking about the virtues.
Hmm.
Are these natural in origin? Are they just part of nature, like gravity, electromagnetism, or is there some root beyond nature that is in some way calling us to moral living, some type of a divine or a transcendent
Yes.
aspect in Stoicism, or were they more of a just a humanistic or a secular approach to life?
Yeah, so nature and God in Stoicism are pretty difficult to distinguish. They
Mm.
believed in God, but what they mean by God is probably pretty different from what you and I mean by God. Um it is not, it's almost God as a principle.
Mm.
It's God, it's quasi um panentheist, if you're familiar with
Okay.
that terminology. Uh, but it is God as this kind of monad principle that, and then importantly, that humans have a unique capacity to connect with because of our status as these rational creatures. So it's not dissimilar from the idea. It is dissimilar, but not completely without similarity to the idea of being created in the image of God in our traditions, because there's something divine out there in the world that the Stoics believed we humans can tap into in a particular, unique, special way. Um, so one of the interesting things about Stoicism is that it has this, I guess, depending on your perspective, this nice or at least interesting or ambivalent uh, kind of relationship to God, where you can be a Stoic naturalist for sure, because there's a deep materialism to it. The world is eternal and the world is all that is. But
Mm.
there is a divine, logical, rational reason ordering the world. And even things like the Stoics could even speak of things like worship of the gods as just and right and proper and reasonable to do, with while also saying this stuff is a little silly on the other hand. So there's kind of an ambivalence about it. Um, the main difference is I would say there is not a loving or a rational or a covenantal or a personal God in kind of Stoic conception, which is not to say that God is kind of cold or indifferent or cruel by any means, but there is a certain streak of fatalism as it
Mm.
relates to um as it relates to kind of, yeah, I guess just fate and the way things are ordered and will come to pass. But I wouldn't say it's a joyless fatalism.
Okay.
It is a there is happiness and delight as well as genuine flourishing to be had when you order your life according to nature in this reasonable way.
Are the morals grounded in this panentheistic presence or being?
Yes,
They are okay.
yes, yes. So there's a yeah, I mean, there's a law of nature in a sense that is reason. You can kind of think your way to it. Um, which is again, I think, it seems to me that is a potential shortcoming. I was about to say, like, there's no lawgiver
Mm.
in Stoicism, but in a sense, that's not quite right because this principle of reason in the world is itself, I think, one might say, the lawgiver. And we receive the law of the rational and we can access it and understand it because of our status as rational creatures. Yeah. I think I saw a hand. Did I see that right, or was that still?
Yeah, I had a question if you don't mind. I was
Sure, yeah.
just, so if Stoicism calls us to live according to nature,
Hmm.
yet our understanding of nature kind of is always partial and evolving. How would they confidently claim to kind of know what alignment with nature really means or what it really requires? And, what do they do with that kind of uncertainty? Does I mean, my assumption would be that like someone like Seneca in on the name of the
Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. Yeah.
yeah, but Seneca wrote like on contrition or something like that. I can't think of the name of the. I have a sense that he would kind of require greater humility, kind of in our moral judgment based on the unknowability of nature.
Yes. So there's a sense of kind of a onward and upward lifelong project of attaining to the status of the sage. And the sage is the person who has kind of accrued enough wisdom. The goal is to do the right thing without hesitation all the time. Like that's what it means to be virtuous. Is you do the thing that is in accordance with nature without the kind of passions getting away, without this conflicted self. But of course, that requires knowing what that right thing to do is. And that's not just a cut and dry, here's a list of 150 rules. It is something that is acquired through communion with other wise people, life experience, observation of the natural world, what we might think of today as science. All of these things are kind of input points. So there's no kind of, yeah, I wouldn't say it's an especially arrogant philosophy in that sense. There's not kind of like, I read the 10 principles of Stoicism and I got it all figured out and there's nothing left for me to do or to learn. Quite the opposite. I think and this kind of the ideal of the sage is almost superhuman. Like no one really gets there. You can aim at it. But I think you just kind of look at the evidence and say, no one is living according to this ideal exactly. And we're all doing our best to get a little bit closer by degree. I think that's what they would say.
I think that sounds super Judeo-Christian.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And I had
All
a
right,
question.
Patricia.
I actually have two questions, but your answers are so thorough. I'll be thinking about your first answer and forget my second question. One, the connection between your concept of God and nature. It seems to me there would be a tie-in there.
Yes, which is to say, it's not easy to distinguish nature and God. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that it seemed to me that you were focused on nature, but you acknowledge God in some form, and so I just wondered, are they kind of melded into the same?
Yes, they are a little bit. So I would say, again, in the Judeo-Christian, there's a strong creator-creature distinction. There's God and then what is not God. And in Stoicism, that's much blurrier in their cosmology. And their cosmology is kind of what the foundation of the ethics. Um, it's a certain view of the world as eternal and immovable, and that's another kind of distinction in the way they think about creation is it's not a finite time limited creation, it's an eternal creation that goes back and it will endure eternally. So there's not dissolution of creation or a moment of creation or anything like that. So yeah, does that answer question one?
Yeah, a question, and I remember question two.
Okay, great.
I'm not hearing a distinct, this is right, this is wrong. And so I'm thinking like in terms of a car accident that I may witness, do I try to help or is it kind of fatalistic?
No, you definitely try to help. Yeah. I think you do because that's the just and right thing to do is to serve the yeah, it is right to serve others. It is right to be useful. It is right to be helpful in as much as you can, but only if that does not compromise your acting according to virtue. So it is not right to lie to be helpful. It is not right in an effort to be helpful, for example. Kind of easy, kind of moral dilemma. But I don't think the Stoics would feel great about the midwives in Egypt who say to whatever is it they say to Pharaoh, like, yeah, we get there and these Hebrew women are just so the baby's already born. They don't love lying in service of justice because they say you've actually compromised justice. And they will so much so that they will prefer suicide to a compromise of one's kind of virtuous character. And that's why someone like Socrates is revered, because Socrates kind of accepts this fate, this judgment, rather than to recant of his ideas. And this is the why he's viewed so sympathetically in the Apology when he drinks the poison. And Seneca is also forced to commit suicide because he's accused rather of treason by an emperor. So yeah, there's actually a lot of discourse on suicide because I think it's like this extreme test case of like, here's how serious we are about virtue, that our virtue is more precious to us than our life.
Hmm.
That's the idea.
But how do you know what is virtuous? I mean, how do you know that lying is not virtuous if it's protecting somebody?
Yeah, I think that would be the point to raise. Um, the yeah, what's this comment here? Maybe Matt, can you fill us on? Can you fill us in on this?
Yeah, there's, I just was thinking about, suicide, Seneca, and,
Oh, sure.
that virtue above all else.
This is it. Yeah. For honor, I think is, if I'm not mistaken, is very common in the kind of Eastern traditions there. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Patricia, to say who's to say that there aren't times where it's not to say that you fudge kind of a virtue in service of a vice, or you allow for a vice in service of a virtue, but I think it is a more capacious understanding of what justice might mean rather than and this is part of what's compelling, I think, about Stoicism in the ancient world is the kind of ethical rigor, is that they don't fudge and they don't cut corners on certain ethical norms and ethical ideals, even in extreme circumstances. Some people find that compelling, and I think some people might find it very challenging and even grotesque. But it's a very ethically rigorous philosophy in that sense.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. You're on mute still, Jackie. There you go.
So with the concept of nature, oftentimes, maybe we've covered a little bit of this, is, oftentimes in nature, the strong prevail, such as
Yes.
the lion, the little guy, and the snake swallows the whole mouse. So, I mean, is there a point in this where that, I mean, and that kind of gets into what Patricia was saying there about
Sure.
about like, like, we're in Kansas, so we had the underground, we did as Kansans, and during the Civil War and different things, there was a lot of lying. I mean, we're just about 4 or 5 blocks from the number one hub of the underground. It's a big old thing here, and and then there's, that's just one aspect in our history. I mean,
yes,
since I don't know how many on the format here are Jews or not, but then we have, our Jewish world with the Holocaust, and
of course, yes,
it's a cross. So back to her point, when you lie to kid, so they would rather die with the people in the Holocaust or die with the slaves of black than to hell.
I don't know. Like I can't say for sure.
Okay, so that's not like an overall concept of virtue to stand like true to
Well,
this.
so maybe I'll say something like this. Like, I don't, maybe this will be helpful.
Okay,
Because
thank you.
virtue is the highest good and truly the only good. Wealth, poverty, slavery, freedom, being married, being single, whether your children outlive you or whether they die young. These are all what the Stoics call adiaphora, or you could say matters of indifference, which is to say that it's not indifference is maybe not the most helpful word because it signals that you don't care at all about these things. What they mean is they are not properly in and of themselves a good on the level of virtue. Only virtue is the good. So, if having wealth can be used to make you more virtuous, well and good. If having wealth makes you vicious, let it go. If being a slave is a barrier to your virtue, perhaps it's something to seek to escape. If being a slave is, I struggle to, maybe that's not the best analogy. I was going to say if it's empowering your virtue in some way. The point is that slavery and freedom, issues of justice like this, do not register in the Stoic conception of the good the way they do, I think, to us as heirs of the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. Um, they would say it's a category error to say being wealthy is better than being poor, or being a freed person is better than being a slave. So that doesn't leave them helpless in their discussion of whether it's right, like whether a genocide is right, or whether it's right to, I think a Stoic could say the mistreatment of slaves is not the natural way of things. But I don't know if they have the resources to say slavery full stop is vicious, because they have a sense of the natural order of things, the fate determining that different people are at different stations, that the powerful have power and the less powerful don't have power. I think the truly innovative thing that they can do is say that the less powerful can be virtuous. There is a way of living a flourishing, virtuous life as a less powerful person, as well as a more powerful person. Um, but so they can kind of flatten it out. Just because you're powerful doesn't mean you're virtuous. But at the same time, just because you're not powerful doesn't mean you're not virtuous. So that was genuinely, I think, not quite controversial, but genuinely interesting in the ancient world. It was challenging assumptions in ways that I think anticipate the kind of Christian revolution as it came down the pipeline into the rest of the Western world. So I'll stop there, but it's not a tidy answer, and I think that's why I would say, as a Christian, there's something really good that my own tradition offers on things like love and charity and a more capacious understanding of not just justice, but righteousness and this divine entry into the world as an agent of love and redemption that is just not quite there. There's compelling ethical ideals, but I don't think there's love in the way that we've come to appreciate in the kind of Western tradition.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that was good. I have a one quick follow-up on that. And then go ahead, Sherry, you ask first.
Okay, thanks. I am just really curious at a personal level, what is compelling to you about this?
Mm,
Why do you, what draws you to study this?
yeah. No, that's great. I think there is there's a completely different world of kind of ethical reasoning and reflection on what a good and beautiful and flourishing human life is in Stoicism that I think serves as a counterweight to maybe a charitable way of saying it is a motivism that can prevail in the world today. Where there, if you might say there's a ditch on both sides. There's a ditch that leans only into kind of like a Disneyfied version of follow your heart and just be loving, and this that actually is a bit disdainful when you come down to it of doing the hard work of thinking wisely and with really intense moral reasoning about things. And we'll just kind of say, um, at the end, isn't it all just love? And I'm like, okay, yeah, well, yes, I want to say I agree, but that doesn't just kind of solve all of our ethical problems. Um, and Stoicism, I think, offers a counterweight to maybe what you might say are some of the excesses of emotivism. And so that's one thing that I find interesting um, about Stoicism. The other thing is that I think they were on to something really important in the sense that they understood that it is our passions and our desires, and in the Christian tradition, what we will talk about is the flesh that really gets us in trouble and gets us set sideways in so many aspects of life, whether it's in work or in our parenting or in our romantic relationships or our friendships. Um, our our passions are perhaps one of the greatest sources of our suffering and the suffering that we cause to others. So, in as much as they have their kind of finger on the problem there, in a similar way to, how Paul does in Romans chapter 7, when he says, I do not understand my own actions. That I assent that I agree with the law that it is good, and I want to obey the law, but the very thing that I don't want to do is what I do, and I don't do the thing that I do want to do.
Like Paul.
I think he's talking about, sorry, what was that?
Yeah, that's Paul.
That is Paul. Yes. So that's Paul in Romans chapter 7. So I think he is on to the kind of some of those same questions that the Stoics are raising. That there's this thing inside of me that is getting me in trouble and is hurting me and the people around me. And I just think the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition at this time in world history were doing some of the best work that humans have ever done, and that the kind of divine revelation that has ever given us on what it means to get our experience of being human from here to something more in line with the way God made us to live, more in line with a kind of new, renewed humanity, more in line with this is kind of the Stoic conception, the way nature intended us to be. So there's a kind of upward trajectory that I see across Stoicism, Judaism, Christianity that is trying to get humanity from whatever's gone wrong here to a better place. And man, I just love those types of ideas. I love hearing the types of things that folks living in that world were debating and thinking about and talking about. And yeah, and I think if you're curious, just even do a Google search or order something by Marcus Aurelius or read Seneca on anger, and I think you'll immediately see the challenge and the wisdom and the beauty of it. I would say it's right on the surface in my view.
Thank you. I mean, you don't think that they might have run into any Buddhists and like got a little inkling from them, do you?
Uh, my gut inclination is no, but I don't know for sure. Even in this kind of there were rumblings and hearsay of kind of what the folks in the East were up to, but not a lot of robust dialogue, I would say.
Thank you.
Marcus Aurelius's name wasn't Marcus Siddhartha Aurelius.
Not,
All right.
not, not, yeah, not to my knowledge. But I will say that other people have made these connections between, and my knowledge base on Buddhism is limited, but am I, Yael, you might be able to remind me. He connects in this book that you read on the plane. He connects to Buddhism a few times in there. Is that right? I don't think she can talk. She's in the library.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was asking you.
wait, hang on. Sorry, the audio is not working really well on my phone, so I'm
Okay.
just putting my
Am I
headphones.
remembering right that Pigliucci
Yeah,
kind of
what about?
connects some dots between Stoicism and Buddhism in a few points in that book?
Ooh, I think he definitely did. Yeah, he drew I'm trying to remember which ones, but he definitely does draw and examine the parallels between Buddhism and Stoicism
Yep.
and other religions too, sometimes Christianity and even sometimes Judaism and other
Hmm.
various um, branches of Eastern thought. And it was a very fascinating parallelism to read through because I realized, wow, there's so much of Stoicism in
Hmm.
every faith. I couldn't
Yep.
believe it. I just
Yep.
couldn't believe it. And even though Stoicism doesn't emphasize charity and love like we talked about at the beginning, it has, which you're right about completely, of course, but I realized that so many other faiths have elements of Stoicism within them, and I just never even
Sure.
realized it. But we're kind of living as Stoics partially all our lives
Partially, yeah.
unconsciously.
Yeah. No, I think that's right.
It was very eye-opening.
Yeah.
Well, Buddhism preceded Stoicism,
Hmm.
but so here's my question, unless anybody else has one, and then I'd love you to round us out with Paul or Christianity and the potential Stoic influence. But here's my question first. It seems like everything is sacrificed on the altar of virtue.
A little bit, yeah.
All ideals, all morals. Now, if just to go back, they were talking earlier about the Holocaust and lying. If a Nazi came to a Stoic back then, mixing time, it was they had a time machine, and
Hmm.
and a Nazi asked you, "Do you know where Jews are hiding?" The moral action would be to say yes if you did, not lie. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
I
I'm not. I'm trying to understand that because that's a troubling.
It is troubling, yes.
Really is.
Yeah, I do wonder. I can't say with confidence, but I will say that there are inclinations in Stoic thought that might lead you to say, well, maybe the answer is yes. And I think there's a visceral sense in all of us of the wrongness of that. And I think, Christian theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was who famously kind of was a pacifist in Germany, German scholar during the Third Reich. Um, and if folks are familiar, he's a fascinating theologian in that he resisted the kind of Nazification of the church in Germany. And towards the end of his life was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. This is a guy who had been a pacifist his whole life and outspokenly so, just because he saw the kind of terrible evil that was being wrought, and then he ended up being executed and hung as part of the final solution in 1944, I want to say. And he's one of the kind of heroes of the Christian tradition in the 20th century, in my view. But when he writes about this, the way he thinks about it, and I think just this is really beautiful because he accepted, in a sense, the moral imperfection of his actions in being involved in an assassination plot against Hitler. And as an outspoken pacifist, and it's not clear that he gave that ideal up, but he knew that he knew that he had sinned, to put it in brief. But he threw himself on the mercy of God in his sin. And his reflection on this point, I think, is really, really beautiful. Yeah. And it shows, I think, he's not a Stoic and not framing himself as a Stoic, but I think this is instructive in the sense of even ethical ideals about virtue can get us into, if we're too rigorous about following them, can put us in situations where we can find ourselves in situations where we feel we have no good options and we have no ethical options. And I think there's deep in our hearts a sense of right and wrong and what ought to be done that maybe is not completely dissimilar from what the Stoics were identifying as our passions. There's a moral compass inside of us that is given by God that transcends even kind of our rational thinking about what we ought and ought not to do at any given situation. And I think being able to act decisively, even if we feel that our actions are imperfect, while holding on to the mercy of God in that moment, is a really beautiful thing that I think gets us closer to the truth than a kind of moral rigor can sometimes. So yeah, I didn't mean to give kind of a little Bonhoeffer devotion.
That's tough. I really do. I relate to the draw of, at least they're focusing on the virtue and good life, the moral life, even if they have a different map or roadmap for how to live it, how to live it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think we could do for some, this is back to like the compelling, I think we could do for some moral, ethical rigor in our day. I think we're often much too squishy, and it's all going to be fine. And maybe this is kind of this is my Protestant kind of Christian thing, the works of the law are kind of the boogeyman in my tradition, and I think Stoicism can be a helpful corrective against some of that.
Okay, yeah. And then just finish up after your question, then just take us into Paul for a few moments. And how does Paul somehow work within that model or is influenced? And then we'll say sayonara. So yeah.
Yes, this is more, it's not a question so much as a comment. I just wanted to say that Pigliucci actually comments on something similar to this, to your question, Dad, when you were saying, what if the Nazi were to approach the Stoic 2,000 years ago? It was fascinating, and I don't remember the entire conversation, but we were on the plane, and I remember my dad was sitting behind me, and I leaned back. I said, Dad, what do you think about this? This is unbelievable. But he was saying how he specifically used the context of, what if we were in the situation of, say, like a Holocaust-like situation.
So he did use the Holocaust example, yeah.
He didn't, I don't remember specifically if he used the Holocaust. I think he did, but he specifically used Nazis. And what if we were to encounter them? What would we say? And he brought in Epictetus to use some of his quotes as kind of guidance. And I don't remember what the ultimate quotes and the ultimate conversation was, but I just wanted to say that it completely aligned with what you were saying, how there's a difference between what the moral thing or the right quote unquote thing to do and what our own moral compass is. And I just found it utterly fascinating because it completely aligned with what you were saying. And he specifically emphasized, I'm not saying that the moral thing to do is necessarily the right thing to do, or the quote unquote right thing to do is what our
Yes.
own moral right should be. So it
Yes.
was just fascinating to hear this conversation and think, oh, I remember about that. And so I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question?
Please.
I'm not sure if the situation is that a Nazi would ask, why would it be the Stoic virtuous rule to say, yes, I know? Wouldn't a true Stoic who cares about virtue and justice and wisdom and the four virtues really say, I know, but I won't implicate myself in your ugliness. You can kill
Yes.
me,
Yes.
and I
I would
won't
rather
tell you.
die. I would rather die than tell you
Oh,
this.
okay. Maybe I misheard because I came very late
Yeah,
to.
I think that's, I didn't say that, but I
Oh,
think that's an option available to the Stoic potentially, is rather than speak an untruth. And this is the thing, you're like, you view your life as less precious than justice and virtue, because justice is a virtue. So a Stoic is very willing to die for a good cause, and very willing to die if the time appointed has come, and can face death courageously. So I think that's maybe as good of an option as the Stoic might think she has in that moment. So yeah, that's a very helpful comment. Thank you for suggesting that.
All right, let's hear about Brother Paul, early Christianity and Stoic engagement.
Yeah.
Never
Yeah,
thought of
absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. So I think the most interesting passage, I already alluded to it, but it does come from
Ah,
that kind of Romans 6 to 8
okay.
sphere, it seems to me. And there's a lot of debate about whether Paul is explicitly engaging Stoic ideas, whether he was familiar with them, but people are connecting these dots. And I think Romans is probably as good of a spot as any. And then there's also a sense that Paul has a moral framework that puts something at the top. It's not maybe virtue. It's maybe it's something like loyalty to Christ, or the preaching of the gospel kind of stands in the place of being the highest good in Paul's mind. And then everything else, in a sense, is relativized according to this. So I'm not sure if this is the most helpful way to read Paul, but I think people have a hard time with Paul's um, compromise. I don't think is an unfair word, of the law in his Christian proclamation. This is his innovation relative to kind of the rest of the Jewish tradition, is that he can do away with the law in a sense in service of this kind of higher, better, new ideal that he thinks has come in Christ. So it's Stoic in its structure, in the sense that there's a virtuous ideal that relativizes the rest of the system. So that's one thing I would say about Paul, and that's more or less the thesis of. I'll do a little show and tell with some books maybe at the end here. More or less the thesis of a scholar called Troels Engberg Peterson, who has written probably the most influential academic book on Paul and Stoicism. The other thing, and this is what I was already saying about Romans chapter 7, where Paul says, it's that thing I quoted, I don't understand my own actions. The thing that I do, I don't do, or the thing that I want to do, I don't do, and I do the very thing that I hate. And I think that's just, man, who can't relate to that? I think a lot of us, all of us, fail to live up to our own moral and ethical ideals. And there's maybe like a 1.5% of the population that just has the moral willpower to live according to our own ideals. But I think most of us, um, yes, Taylor, I think you're right that it is a better, I mean, that's how Jesus frames it himself in Matthew. Don't think that I've come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. But Paul does use language of abolishment in Ephesians, if you believe Paul wrote Ephesians, which I do. But I would qualify that statement too. I don't think Paul completely wants to do away with the law. Just side side note there. But I think this Romans 6 to 8 bit, where Paul, and this is beautiful reading if you just want to jump in and read Romans 6 to 8 if you're not familiar with it. But what Paul is doing there is identifying this kind of human weakness apart from what he understands as the empowerment of God's Spirit to live not in slavery to sin, but as a servant of righteousness. So this, in my view, is the missing piece in Stoicism. I alluded earlier to, my friend who says the Stoics don't have a good answer for why human beings are so terrible at doing this whole thing. And I think, our tradition has an answer that in the language of John's gospel, you need to be born again. And going back to the Hebrew Bible, the heart of stone needs to be replaced with a heart of flesh. And there's a divine renewal and empowerment that is necessary that I think is a really compelling counterpoint to a lot of the very insightful and wise and even beautiful things that we find in the Stoic tradition, where you can say, yes, and don't we all just need help to live the way that the rational part of us knows that we ought to be living but can't do?
Yeah.
So there's a dependence on God that is shot through the Christian tradition and Paul in particular, that I think is a really nice complement to what we find in Stoicism. And I think it's not at all it's not at all a stretch to imagine that Paul's early readers or his auditors who maybe some of them would have been familiar with or even lived according to a lot of Stoic ideals, and then hear this good news that the Spirit of God has come to bury the dead part of you that was kind of burdened by sin and raise you into a new way of being, not by some kind of rationalistic self-improvement project, but by a divine empowerment and renewal that couldn't properly be sourced inside of yourself. It needed to come from without. So I think that's maybe what I would leave us with in terms of Paul and Stoicism.
No, that's the truth is we should have a dialogue on Paul sometimes, because Paul is I know people struggle with Paul both within Christianity and obviously within Judaism, but Paul, I've said this publicly, if Paul and I were sharing the same hood together, town, I would invite him regularly for the Sabbath, because I think he is a very profound thinker, even where we may part ways. And I think that's a beautiful way of sort of rounding everything out, that especially with the idea of being born again, as you called it. Literally, it's in the Greek, it's more like born from above.
From above,
Yeah.
yes.
And so that when Paul speaks of in 2 Corinthians 5 about being a new
New
creation.
creation, yeah.
We are, as human beings, we are frail, we are mortal, and it's not ultimately, at least I'm speaking personally, it's not ultimately redeeming to think that's my ultimate potential, that nothing else in this grand universe can give me uplift and hope and and a new birth,
Hmm.
new hope. So it is interesting that Stoicism never caught on broadly like Christianity or some of the other faiths. I think that might have, I should say, I wonder if that was part of the reason why that people wanted something a little more than simply a rational principle. They
Yep.
wanted a relational presence.
Yeah, this is it. Yes. I think that's I just fully resonate with that. I think there's something very different about a conception of God or the divine that is truth and one that is love.
Mhm.
Um, which is not to say that love is distinct from truth. Of course, it
Right.
isn't. I think something I've been noodling on recently, and I'm thinking about writing something up on this, is there are kind of three different types of love. And I should give a hat tip to the pastor at my church because he's helped me think about this as well. But there's an accepting love and a delighting love and a what we'll call perfecting love. And by
Mm. Mm.
perfecting love, I mean it's the love that seeks to help the other improve. It's a love that makes us better. It's a love
Wow.
that calls us up into some sort of ideal.
Yeah.
And I think this is like the rigorous father who wants you to be excellent
Mm.
and is really calling you to a better standard. And I think something like Stoicism really excels at this type of love, but it's not a full picture of love.
Yeah.
And then there's an accepting love, which is not the opposite, but another image of love. It's the unconditional love that a parent has for a child, where you accept them no matter what, and you love and receive them. It's the I will love you no matter what type of love. And I think in the middle here, there's what I want to call delighting love, which is it's actually the I like you love. I enjoy spending time with you. I enjoy being with you. It's a love that we associate with friendship, but I think also with romance and with uh, dating relationships and marriage, where it's like, I could just be around you, talking to you because I love you. You're not a
Hmm.
project that I'm trying to make better. And it's not even that I'm forced to love you and I have this accepting love that I can't even help. So I think though that delighting love, that accepting love, I think these are the counterweights that Judeo-Christian conception of God brings to the equation. But that's not to say that the perfecting love, that, there's I love you no matter what love, there's I like hanging out with you love, and there's I believe in you love, which I actually think is the perfecting love, the I want you to be better. I believe in this future version of yourself that's the best version of yourself that you can be. So I'm preaching a little bit here, but
No, that's
I
beautiful.
want to be respectful of time.
That's yeah, thank you. And what better way to end on than on the notion of perfecting love, right? That's John.
Hmm. Yes.
It's
Perfect love casts out fear, which is, and
fear. That's
perfect, that
right.
language is it's complete love. It's fulsome
Yeah.
love. So I would say that's all three.
So that's a beautiful meditation and virtue that I think we should all try to live with, whatever your faith or non-faith orientation is. Love perfects if we allow it
Mm.
to. And I think we can never be perfect, but we can, as one sage once said, we can always be in the process of perfecting.
Hmm.
And coming together like this helps us think about the grand issues of life. And we need to do this. We need to root into who we are so that we can blossom and ultimately become something better, because that's our ultimate potential. So I thank you all here for your presence, for your questions. It was really wonderful, Zach, having you.
Mm.
And thanks for for your time. You thought you want to show the couple of books that you wanted
Oh,
to
yes. Why
leave us
don't I
with?
real quick? So the first we already referenced, and I think this is being recorded. So this is How to Be a Stoic. It's by a philosopher, Italian scholar. Nice introduction, accessible introduction to Stoicism. Um, and then I'll just show this real quick. This is like a collection of essays, Stoicism and Early Christianity. So this kind of gets to the question you had, Rabbi Joe, about, is Paul talking to Stoic ideas? Is he engaging it? And there's the same with Matthew's gospel, same with John's gospel, all sorts of early Christian texts. This is the other one that I reference, Paul and the Stoics. That's by Troels Engberg Peterson. And then another one by a scholar actually from the Chicago area here, Pauline Theology as a Way of Life, by Josh Jipp. There's a really nice chapter at the beginning here on, I'll just read you the title for the chapter, Ancient Philosophy and the Quest for Human Flourishing. So that's a really nice kind of background to this philosophical world for early Judaism and Christianity. And then the last thing I'll mention is this guy, Ryan Holiday, who has a whole collection of books. This is the most recent one. And it's all kind of a popularization of Stoicism for a modern audience. Extremely accessible, really fun to read. He has a lot of anecdotes and stories from people throughout history, and just super, super down to earth. But kind of maybe no substitute for just picking up Marcus Aurelius's Meditation and just jumping right in as well. So yeah, that's my book recommendations.
Wonderful. All right, brother, doctor, I'll call you D. Phil.
Thank you.
Or just Phil.
Just Phil's fine.
Thank you all for coming. Sherry, will you, what do we just, who am I leading it? Who's leading?